So glad you're back. I've got a crazy tale for you today.
The day before the Sterling 50th anniversary gala, the air in the family estate tasted of expensive lilies and desperation. Julianne Sterling stood on the mezzanine, watching the chaos below. A small army of decorators moved with frantic precision, draping silk across the grand ballroom and polishing the marble until it shone like a mirror. At the center of the storm stood her sister, barking orders that sounded more like threats. Serena Sterling was in her element, draped in a sample of the new Sterling Luxe silk line that Julian knew was actually a cheap synthetic blend. The fabric caught the light, but up close, the weave was dishonest, just like everything else Serena touched. "Not there, you idiot," Serena snapped at a florist. "The lilies need to frame the podium. Tomorrow night is about legacy. My legacy. Try not to ruin it with your incompetence." Julianne descended the stairs, her movements quiet and deliberate. She wore a simple charcoal suit, a stark contrast to the shimmering gold gown Serena was currently having pinned to her frame by a kneeling assistant. "You look stressed, Serena," Julianne said, her voice a cool stream of water cutting through the heat of the room. "Perhaps you should sit down. High blood pressure isn't a good look for a CEO." Serena turned, her eyes narrowing as she took in her sister's modest attire. A smirk played on her lips, the kind of expression a cat gives a mouse it's already decided to kill. "Stress is for people who have something to lose, Julianne. I'm about to secure the final round of funding that will put the Sterling name on every continent. You wouldn't understand the weight of that. You just push papers and look for errors that don't exist." "Oh, the errors exist," Julianne replied, stepping closer. She reached out and touched the edge of the gold silk on her sister's shoulder. It felt cold and slick like oil. "In fact, I've spent the morning reviewing the final audit for the gala presentation. There are some discrepancies. You might want to take a look before the board sees the projections tomorrow." Serena laughed, a sharp, manic sound that echoed off the crystal chandeliers. She batted Julian's hand away as if she were a bothersome insect. "Discrepancies? You've always been jealous of my vision. You see a decimal point out of place. I see a billion-dollar empire. Don't try to play the big sister role now. It's pathetic. You're a forensic analyst because you're too dull to lead. Tomorrow, when Arthur and Beatrice stand on that stage with me, you'll be in the back row where you belong." Arthur Sterling stepped into the foyer then, his face flushed with the pride of a man who believed his own lies. He placed a hand on Serena's shoulder, ignoring Julianne entirely. "The guest list is perfect, darling. Marcus Thorne just confirmed he's bringing 3 of the biggest hedge fund managers in the city. They're ready to sign." "Of course they are," Serena purred, preening under her father's touch. "They know a winner when they see one." Julianne watched them, the enabler and the thief. She felt the weight of the USB drive in her pocket, a small, silver anchor of truth. "Arthur, are you sure about this? The projections Serena is using, they aren't sustainable. If the investors see the actual debt-to-equity ratio, this gala won't be a celebration. It will be an execution." Arthur finally looked at her, his expression hardening into a mask of disappointment. "Julianne, enough. Your sister has saved this family from the stagnation of your careful accounting. If you can't be a team player, perhaps you shouldn't attend at all. We don't need your negativity casting a shadow over Serena's moment." "I wouldn't miss it for the world," Julianne said, her voice dropping to a whisper that made Arthur blink. "I just wanted to give you one last chance to be honest. Structures built on sand have a habit of shifting when the tide comes in, and the tide is coming in tomorrow at 8 o'clock sharp." Serena rolled her eyes, turning back to the mirror to admire her reflection. "Go back to your spreadsheets, Julianne. Leave the real world to the adults." As Julianne turned to leave, she caught the eye of Detective Sarah Vance, who was standing near the entrance in plain clothes, ostensibly checking the security detail. The detective gave a microscopic nod. The trap was set. The warrants were signed. The investors Marcus was bringing weren't looking for a deal, they were looking for a confession. Julianne walked out into the cool evening air, the scent of the lilies finally fading. She pulled out her phone and sent a single text to Marcus Thorne. The warning was ignored. "Proceed with the final sequence." She looked back at the house, the windows glowing with a warmth that was entirely artificial. Inside, Serena was likely toasting to a future that didn't exist. Julian felt no guilt, only a profound, icy clarity. Tomorrow night, the Sterling name would indeed be on everyone's lips, but not for the reasons Serena expected. 24 hours. The countdown had reached its final cycle, and for the first time in years, Julianne Sterling slept with the peacefulness of a lion who knew exactly when the hunt would end. The next morning, the Sterling Global Headquarters hummed with the frantic, artificial energy of a kingdom preparing for a coronation it couldn't afford. Julianne Sterling sat in her glass-walled office, the cold, brushed aluminum of her laptop chilled against her fingertips. On her screen, a series of shell company ledgers bled red, a digital autopsy of the family's legacy. The rhythmic, aggressive click of stilettos on marble announced the arrival of the storm before the office door even swung open. Serena Sterling marched in, trailing the scent of synthetic oud and expensive desperation. She didn't knock. She never did. Behind her, 2 junior analysts scurried away, their eyes averted as they tried to blend into the neutral-toned wallpaper. "Why is this still on my desk?" Serena demanded, slamming a thick folder onto Julian's keyboard. Her manicured nails, painted a shade of red that looked like dried blood, tapped impatiently on the plastic. "I told you to sign off on the valuation for the new fragrance line. The investors are coming to the gala tonight, and I need the forensic stamp of approval. Your stamp." Julianne didn't look up immediately. She finished typing a line of code that would finalize the transfer of the Sterling building's primary mortgage to an anonymous holding company, one she happened to control. "The valuation is inflated by 40%, Serena. There are no actual purchase orders from the Parisian distributors. It's a fabrication." Serena let out a sharp, jagged laugh that echoed off the glass. "It's called projected growth, you dull girl. But I suppose a glorified bookkeeper wouldn't understand the nuances of luxury branding. You've always been so literal, Julianne. It's why Father never trusted you with the keys to the kingdom." "He trusted me with the audits," Julianne said quietly, finally meeting her sister's gaze. "Because you're a mouse. You like the dark, dusty corners." Serena leaned over the desk, her shadow falling across Julian's face. "But the light is on now. I'm moving your department to the basement level starting Monday. This office is being converted into a VIP lounge for the fragrance launch. Pack your things by 5. At the doorway, Arthur Sterling appeared, his silk tie perfectly knotted, though his eyes lacked their usual luster. He looked at Julianne with a mixture of pity and annoyance. "Do as your sister says, Julianne. We need to present a united front for the gala. Don't be difficult. Serena is the face of this company, you're just the ink." "The ink is what makes the contracts binding, Father," Julianne replied. Arthur waved a hand dismissively. "Enough. Serena, your mother is waiting at the jeweler's. She needs the Sterling tiara polished for tonight. We must look like the royalty they expect us to be." As they swept out, Serena paused, looking back over her shoulder with a smirk. "Oh, and Julianne, don't bother wearing that gray suit tonight. You're not on the guest list for the main ballroom. You'll be stationed in the counting room to handle the silent auction receipts. It's where you belong, isn't it? With the numbers." The door clicked shut. The silence that followed was heavy, vibrating with the ghost of Serena's arrogance. Julianne waited until their footsteps faded before she picked up her phone. She dialed a number she knew by heart. "Marcus Thorne," a voice answered on the first ring. "It's time, Marcus," Julianne said, her voice steady as a surgeon's hand. "They've moved the gala's final presentation to 8 o'clock. Is the paperwork for the debt-to-equity swap finalized?" "Signed, sealed, and ready to be delivered," Marcus replied. "The Sterling name is currently a hollow shell. You own the debt, the building, and by tonight, you'll own the very chairs they're sitting on. Are you sure you want to do this in front of the investors?" Julianne looked at the box Serena had tossed onto her desk, a box meant for her personal belongings. "Serena wants a show. It would be rude not to give her one." She hung up and pulled a small, black USB drive from her drawer. It felt heavy, a physical weight of 5 years of silence and systematic preparation. Tonight, the mouse would stop counting the crumbs and simply take the house. 10 hours remained. Julian stood and looked out the window at the city skyline. The countdown was no longer in days, but in heartbeats. By the time the first bottle of champagne was popped at the gala, the Sterling empire wouldn't just be crumbling, it would already be hers. She just had to wait for Serena to take the stage. The scent of aged cedar and expensive stationery filled Marcus Thorne's office, a stark contrast to the sterile, high-pressure atmosphere Julianne Sterling had escaped only an hour before. She sat in a deep leather chair, her hands steady as she watched the litigator review the contents of the black USB drive. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city hummed, oblivious to the fact that the Sterling empire was currently being dismantled bit by bit on a computer screen. Marcus leaned back, the light catching the silver at his temples. He looked at her with a mixture of professional respect and something bordering on awe. "I've seen forensic audits before, Julianne, but this is a masterpiece. You didn't just find the holes, you mapped the entire plumbing of Serena's fraud. Every offshore account, every forged signature by Beatrice Sterling, and every penny Arthur diverted to cover the initial losses." "It wasn't difficult once I realized they weren't even trying to hide it from me," she replied, her voice like silk over stone. "They assumed I was too small to notice, or too grateful for their charity to care." "Well, the charity ends tonight," Marcus said, sliding a thick manila envelope across the desk. "These are the final seizure notices. Since you purchased the underlying debt through your holding company, you have the legal right to freeze all Sterling assets the moment the fraud is publicly acknowledged. The house, the cars, the brand, everything." Julianne felt the weight of the envelope. It was the physical manifestation of 5 years of silence. "And the authorities? Detective Sarah Vance is on standby. She's seen the preliminary files I sent over. She's just waiting for the public catalyst to execute the warrants. She wants the show as much as you do." Julianne stood, the envelope tucked under her arm. "Good, because Serena is about to give the performance of a lifetime." 3 hours later, the countdown had dwindled to 7. Julianne arrived at the Sterling family estate to collect the final piece of her mother's legacy. The foyer was a chaotic hive of activity. Caterers hurried past with silver trays, and the air was thick with the cloying scent of Lily's and Serena's signature, overpriced perfume. She found her sister in the grand drawing room, surrounded by 3 socialites and a photographer from a high society magazine. Serena Sterling was a vision in gold silk, her laughter ringing out like breaking glass. She was holding a small, velvet-lined box, showing its contents to the admiring circle. "It's the Sterling solitaire," Serena boasted, her voice carrying across the room. "Grandmother's original setting. I've had it reset for the gala tonight. It's the symbol of our family's enduring strength." Julianne froze. That ring was the only thing her mother had specifically left for her in the original will, the one Arthur and Beatrice had misplaced after the funeral. She stepped into the room, her presence a sudden chill in the warm air. Serena looked up, her smile turning into a sharp, condescending smirk. "Oh, look, the help has arrived to watch the festivities. Julianne, dear, don't stand there looking so dowdy. You're making the lighting look bad for the photos." The socialites giggled, their eyes scanning Julianne's simple charcoal suit with visible disdain. "That ring belongs to me, Serena," Julianne said, her voice calm but echoing in the sudden silence of the room. "And you know it." Serena's laugh was a sharp bark. She stepped closer, the gold of her dress shimmering. "This ring belongs to the Sterling CEO. It belongs to the woman who saved this family while you were busy playing with spreadsheets. You're lucky I even let you live in the pool house for as long as I did." She turned back to her friends, dismissing Julianne with a wave of her hand. "Honestly, the entitlement of some people. She thinks because she has the name, she deserves the jewels." One of the socialites, a woman Julianne recognized as a major investor's daughter, sneered. "Is she always this delusional, Serena?" "Only when she forgets her place," Serena replied. She turned back to Julianne, her eyes narrowing. "Actually, I've decided. I'm selling the stone after tonight. The proceeds will go toward the new Sterling Foundation. It's far more useful as a tax write-off than sitting on your finger. Julianne felt the familiar heat of rage, but she didn't let it reach her face. Instead, she reached into her bag and pulled out a small, laminated card, a direct line to the private vault where the Sterling family's most sensitive documents were kept. "You can't sell what you don't own, Serena," she said softly. Serena stepped into Julianne's personal space, the smell of champagne and arrogance radiating off her. "Watch me. I own everything in this house. I own the air you're breathing right now. Now get out before I have security drag you out in front of the cameras. You're ruining my mood." Julianne looked at her sister, really looked at her. She saw the desperation behind the gold silk, the frantic need to maintain a lie that was already collapsing. She leaned in, whispering so only Serena could hear. "Enjoy the ring for the next 4 hours. It's the last piece of Sterling history you'll ever touch." She turned and walked out, the sound of Serena's indignant screech following her into the hall. As Julianne reached the front door, her phone buzzed. A text from Marcus: "Everything is in place. The media is arriving. The trap is set." Julianne looked back at the house, the grand facade glowing under the evening lights. In 4 hours, the lights would go out on the Sterling name forever. She pulled out her phone and dialed a number she had memorized weeks ago. "Detective Vance, it's Julianne. You can move the units into position. The gala is about to begin." The following afternoon, the air inside the Sterling Global headquarters tasted of ozone and expensive floor wax. Julianne Sterling walked through the lobby, her footsteps muffled by the thick, hand-woven rugs that cost more than a mid-sized sedan. She wasn't here for a confrontation, but the atmosphere was brittle, like glass cooled too quickly. The employees moved with a frantic, jittery energy, their eyes darting toward the executive elevators. They knew the foundation was shaking, even if they couldn't see the cracks yet. She reached her old cubicle on the forensic floor, only to find a cardboard box sitting on her chair. Serena Sterling stood leaning against the partition, her arms crossed over a cream-colored silk blouse. She looked like the picture of corporate success, but the frantic way she tapped her manicured nails against her forearm betrayed the truth. "I saved you the trouble of packing," Serena said, her voice echoing in the quiet office. She kicked the box toward Julianne. "Security was going to toss it, but I thought I'd give you one last look at what failure looks like. It's a shame, really. You had the Sterling name, but you never had the stomach for the Sterling climb." Julianne didn't flinch. She reached into the box, her fingers brushing against a framed photo of her late grandfather. She felt the cold glass and the steady beat of her own heart. "The climb is only impressive if there's a mountain under your feet, Serena. Right now, you're just standing on a pile of other people's money. It's a very thin layer of ice." Serena let out a sharp, jagged laugh. "The ice is 10 feet thick, Julianne. By tomorrow night's gala, the merger will be finalized, and I'll be the youngest woman to lead a top-tier investment firm in the country. You'll be, where? Auditing tax returns in a basement." Arthur Sterling emerged from the corner office, his face a mask of practiced stoicism. He didn't look at Julianne, his gaze fixed on the digital ticker tape scrolling across the wall. "Serena, the legal team needs those signatures for the final disclosure. Stop wasting time with the help." "I'm leaving, Arthur," Julianne said, her voice calm and level. She turned to her father, seeing the gray fatigue behind his eyes. "But before I go, you might want to look at the third-party audit of the offshore holdings. The numbers don't just look wrong, they look impossible. It's a lifeline if you're brave enough to take it." Arthur finally looked at her, his lip curling in a sneer that mirrored Serena's. "I built this legacy. I know where every cent is. You've always been jealous of your sister's vision. Don't let the door hit you on your way, out of a life you couldn't handle." The dismissal was final, a sharp slap of rejection that would have stung a month ago. Now it was just data. Julianne picked up her box, the weight of it familiar and grounding. As she walked toward the elevators, she passed Beatrice Sterling, who was huddled in a glass-walled conference room, frantically signing a stack of documents. Her mother's hand was shaking so badly the pen left jagged ink trails on the paper. In the elevator, Julianne pulled out her phone. The screen glowed, reflecting the steel walls. A message from Marcus Thorne sat at the top of her notifications. The forensic trail is locked. The SEC has the preliminary file. They're waiting for the gala. She pressed the button for the lobby, feeling the slight drop in her stomach as the car descended. She had given them the warning. She had offered the last lifeline. Their arrogance had turned it into a noose. As she stepped out into the humid afternoon air, the city noise washed over her. She saw Marcus's black sedan idling at the curb. He stepped out, his expression unreadable. "They didn't listen," Julian said, sliding into the passenger seat. "They never do," Marcus replied, his voice a low rumble. "The gala starts in 24 hours. Are you ready for the fallout?" Julian looked at the towering Sterling building in the rearview mirror. The sun was setting, casting long, dark shadows across the glass facade. "I'm not the one who needs to be ready. The storm is already inside the building." She reached into her bag and touched the encrypted drive, the sharp edges of the plastic casing a reminder of the truth she held. Tomorrow, the Sterling name wouldn't be a legacy. It would be a crime scene. The evening of the Sterling Legacy gala arrived with a chilling precision, draped in the kind of forced opulence that only old money, and those desperately faking it, could summon. The grand ballroom was a cavern of gold leaf and cut crystal, smelling of overwatered lilies, and the sharp, metallic tang of expensive floor wax. Julianne Sterling stood at the edge of the mezzanine, her fingers lightly grazing the marble balustrade. The stone was cold, a stark contrast to the humid tension simmering in her chest. She had chosen her attire with surgical intent. While the other women moved in clouds of tulle and neon-bright silks, she wore a charcoal velvet gown that seemed to swallow the light. It was elegant, understated, and utterly invisible to the untrained eye. To the elite gathered below, she looked like a shadow. To herself, she felt like a ghost haunting her own funeral. "You're late," a voice snapped from behind her. Julian didn't need to turn to recognize the cadence of entitlement. Serena Sterling stepped into view, a vision in shimmering rose gold sequins that caught every stray beam from the chandeliers. Her perfume, a cloying blend of jasmine and something synthetic, preceded her like a physical barrier. She looked Julian up and down, her lip curling in a practiced sneer that she usually reserved for the domestic staff. "I see you decided to dress for a wake," Serena said, her voice carrying just far enough to catch the attention of a nearby group of donors. "Though I suppose it's fitting. You've always been the morning type, Julian, always grieving for a life you were never meant to lead." Julian met her sister's gaze with a level stare that would have unnerved a more perceptive woman. "It's a gala for the Sterling Legacy, Serena. I thought I should dress for the occasion." Serena let out a sharp, brittle laugh, adjusting the heavy diamond necklace that Julian knew, with forensic certainty, had been purchased with a loan secured against a property that didn't exist. "The legacy is me. Look around. These people aren't here for the Sterling name. They're here for the Sterling future. My future." She leaned in closer, her eyes flashing with a manic sort of triumph. "I've invited the press for the 10 o'clock announcement. By tomorrow morning, the Sterling Global Initiative will be the largest luxury investment fund in the hemisphere. And you'll be exactly where you belong, in a cubicle filing the paperwork for my success." She reached out, flicking a stray hair from Julian's shoulder with a gesture that was more of a dismissal than a touch. "Try not to spill champagne on yourself. The dry cleaning probably costs more than your rent." With a final, mocking pat on Julian's arm, she swept away, her sequins clinking like armor. Julian watched her go, her pulse a steady, rhythmic thrum in her ears. She felt the weight of the encrypted drive in her small clutch, its sharp edges pressing against the fabric. "She's peeking," a low rumble came from her left. Marcus Thorne stepped out from the shadows of a velvet curtain, looking every bit the high-stakes litigator in a tailored tuxedo. He didn't look at Julian. Instead, his eyes followed Serena as she sashayed toward the center of the room, where Arthur Sterling and Beatrice Sterling stood like statues of faded royalty. "The higher the climb, the more spectacular the terminal velocity," Julian murmured. "The board members are all here," Marcus said, his voice barely a whisper. "Arthur has been boasting about the new expansion for an hour. He's already spent the projected first quarter dividends in his head. He bought a yacht this morning, Julian, on credit. Julian glanced toward her parents. Arthur was holding court with a group of venture capitalists, his chest puffed out, his face flushed with the pride of a man who thought he had finally outrun his debts. Beatrice stood beside him, her smile tight and frozen, her eyes darting nervously around the room. She was the one who had signed the passive documents, the one who had looked the other way while Serena gutted the family's remaining credibility. "Do they have any idea?" Julian asked. "Arthur thinks he's a genius. Beatrice thinks she's safe," Marcus replied. "They've placed all their bets on Serena's new fund. They don't realize they're standing on a trapdoor, and Serena is the one with her finger on the lever." "No," Julian said, her voice turning as cold as the marble beneath her hand. "I'm the one with the lever. Serena just built the door." She saw Detective Sarah Vance across the room, dressed in a sharp navy suit that blended perfectly with the security detail. They shared a brief, imperceptible nod. The pieces were moving. The witnesses were positioned, the bankers, the lawyers, the socialites whose reputations were tied to the Sterling name. They were all here to witness the coronation. The lights in the ballroom dimmed slightly, a signal that the formal program was beginning. A spotlight found the podium at the far end of the room. Serena began to move toward it, her rose gold dress shimmering like a forest fire. She looked back once, her eyes finding Julian in the shadows of the mezzanine. She blew a mock kiss, a final gesture of supreme, unshakable arrogance. Julian didn't move. She didn't flinch. She simply watched as her sister ascended the stairs to the stage. The room fell into an expectant hush, the only sound the faint bubbles popping in 1,000 crystal flutes. "It's time," Marcus whispered. Julian opened her clutch and felt the cool plastic of the drive. She looked down at the sea of expectant faces, at the parents who had dismissed her, and at the sister who had stolen her birthright to build a kingdom of glass. Serena reached the microphone, her smile radiant, her hands spreading wide to embrace the room. "Welcome," she began, her voice amplified and echoing, "to the beginning of the rest of the Sterling story." Julian stepped away from the balustrade and began her descent toward the floor. The storm wasn't coming anymore. It was already in the room, and she was the only one who knew the windows were about to shatter. The clicking of Julian's heels against the polished marble floor sounded like the steady beat of a drum, a rhythmic countdown to the end of an era. Above her, on the velvet-draped stage, Serena stood bathed in golden light, her teeth gleaming as she spoke of legacy and the unbreakable Sterling spirit. The air in the ballroom was thick with the scent of expensive lilies and the underlying metallic tang of floor wax, a combination that had always made Julian feel like she was attending a funeral rather than a gala. "And to those who doubted the vision," Serena said, her voice dripping with a performative sweetness that made the board members in the front row lean in, "those who stayed in the shadows while I built this empire, I hope you enjoy the view from the sidelines." She glanced toward the stairs, her eyes locking onto Julian's for a fraction of a second. The smirk she flashed was a jagged blade of pure, unadulterated arrogance. "Some people are born to lead, and others are simply born to watch." Julian didn't stop. She reached the base of the stage just as Marcus stepped out from behind a heavy curtain, his hand moving toward the AV console. She felt the cool, solid weight of the USB drive in her palm, her secret power, the culmination of 5 years of forensic digging. "I'm not here to watch, Serena," Julian said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it possessed a crystalline clarity that cut through the amplified echoes of the room. Serena laughed, a sharp, dismissive sound that carried through the microphone. "Security! My sister seems to have forgotten her place again. Please escort her out before she embarrasses herself further." Julian didn't wait for the guards. She nodded to Marcus. The massive LED screen behind Serena flickered. The promotional video of luxury yachts and soaring stock charts vanished, replaced by a stark, black-and-white spreadsheet. At the top, in bold, undeniable letters, were the words, "Forensic Audit, Sterling Global Holdings." The room plunged into a silence so absolute it felt physical. Serena turned, her gaze sweeping upward. As the first line items appeared, millions of dollars funneled into offshore accounts, the forged signatures of their mother, and the blatant evidence of the Ponzi scheme. Her expression didn't just change, it disintegrated. The radiant, practiced smile she wore like armor shattered, leaving her mouth hanging open in a jagged, silent the high-definition glow of the stage lights caught the sudden, frantic twitch in her left eyelid, a rhythmic ticking that betrayed her internal panic. Her skin, usually a flawless olive, drained to the color of curdled milk, making the heavy contouring on her cheekbones look like bruises. Her chest hitched in shallow, jagged bursts as she stared at the screen, her pupils dilating until her eyes looked like two black holes of pure terror. The poise she had spent decades cultivating vanished, replaced by a raw, animalistic desperation that made her look small, old, and utterly broken. Arthur Sterling stood up so abruptly his chair toppled over. His face was a dangerous shade of crimson, his eyes darting from the screen to his daughter on the stage. Beside him, Beatrice Sterling let her champagne flute slip. It shattered against the marble with a sound like a gunshot, the sparkling liquid soaking into her silk gown, but she didn't seem to notice. Her hands were trembling violently as she stared at her own forged signature magnified 10 feet high. "That's a lie," Serena gasped, though her voice lacked the strength to reach the back of the room. "It's a fabrication. It's a court-admissible forensic trail," a new voice rang out. Detective Sarah Vance stepped from the shadows of the foyer, her badge catching the light of the chandeliers. She didn't move toward the stage yet. She simply stood there, an immovable wall of authority. The board members, sensing the shift in the wind, began to physically pull their chairs away from the Sterling family table, creating a literal circle of isolation around Arthur and Beatrice. Julianne stepped up the first 2 stairs, placing her at eye level with her sister. She didn't gloat. She didn't raise her voice. She simply watched the sweat bead on Serena's forehead. "You told me I didn't belong in this family because I didn't understand the Sterling story," Julianne said, her voice carrying to every corner of the silent ballroom. "But I'm the only one who actually read the books. And as of 5 minutes ago, the bank has executed the lien on every asset tied to this fraud. You don't own the company, Serena. You don't even own the dress you're wearing. I do." Julianne turned her back on the stage, the silence of the room her final tribute. She walked toward the exit, her head held high, leaving the wreckage of the empire behind her. Security wasn't coming for her. They were moving toward the woman still standing under the spotlights, frozen in the glare of her own exposed lies. Julianne reached the heavy oak doors and pushed them open, stepping out into the cool night air without looking back once. The heavy oak doors had barely clicked shut behind Julianne Sterling when the sound of muffled chaos erupted from within the ballroom. The cool night air didn't just touch her skin. It seemed to scrub the stifling scent of expensive lilies and desperation from her lungs. She stood on the wide stone portico, her heels clicking a steady, rhythmic beat against the granite as she walked toward the waiting black SUV. She didn't get 5 steps before the doors behind her flew open again. "You thief! You jealous, pathetic little bitch." Serena Sterling stumbled onto the landing, her designer gown snagging on the doorframe. The poise she had spent a decade cultivating was gone, replaced by a frantic, jagged energy. Her hair, usually a perfect architectural feat, had begun to fray at the temples, and a single diamond earring was missing. She looked less like a CEO and more like a cornered animal. Julianne stopped and turned slowly. She didn't speak. She didn't have to. The silence was a mirror, and Serena clearly hated what she saw in it. "You think this holds up?" Serena screamed, her voice cracking as it echoed across the manicured lawn. "You think you can just walk in and claim a legacy that isn't yours? I built this. I am the face of Sterling. You're just the girl who hides in the basement with her spreadsheets." "I didn't claim your legacy, Serena," Julianne said, her voice a low, steady contrast to the other woman's hysteria. "I bought your debt. There's a significant legal difference." Behind Serena, the enablers began to emerge like rats fleeing a hold that had already filled with water. Arthur Sterling appeared first, his face a ghostly shade of gray. He didn't look at the daughter who had just been humiliated. He looked at the daughter who now held the checkbook. "Julianne, sweetheart," Arthur said, stepping past Serena as if she were a piece of discarded furniture. His voice was oily, thick with a sudden, desperate affection. "We need to talk. There's been a terrible misunderstanding. Serena, she's been under a lot of pressure. She didn't mean the things she said. We can fix this. As a family." Beatrice Sterling followed, her hand trembling as she clutched a silk wrap around her shoulders. She wouldn't meet Julian's eyes, focusing instead on the gravel driveway. "We can go inside," Beatrice whispered. "We can tell the guests it was a performance, a dramatic announcement of a merger." The sheer audacity of the suggestion made Julian's pulse skip, but she didn't let the flicker of rage reach her face. She watched as Arthur reached out, his hand hovering near Julian's arm, seeking the familiar leverage of paternal authority. "Don't!" Julian said. The single word stopped him midair. "I'm not a monster, Julian," Arthur pleaded, his eyes darting toward the street where the first set of blue and red lights had just appeared. "I was misled. I signed those documents because I trusted her. She's the one who managed the accounts. I'll testify to that. I'll give the authorities everything they need to see that she acted alone." Serena spun around, her mouth falling open. "Dad, what are you saying?" "Be quiet, Serena." Arthur snapped, the mask of the doting father vanishing to reveal the cold survivalist beneath. "You've ruined us. You've dragged the Sterling name through the mud with your vanity and your greed. If Julian says the assets are hers, then they are hers. She's the only one with the sense to run them." The betrayal was so swift, so clinical, that even Julian felt a chill. Serena's face underwent a horrifying transformation. The skin around her eyes puckered, her expensive foundation cracking like dry earth under the harsh floodlights of the portico. Her mouth worked soundlessly, a fish gasping for air as the reality of her father's abandonment hit her harder than any legal document could. Her shoulders slumped, the regal posture collapsing into a hollow, trembling wreck. She looked at her mother, but Beatrice only tightened her wrap and looked away. The sound of gravel crunching signaled the arrival of the authorities. 2 black sedans pulled up behind the SUV, and Detective Sarah Vance stepped out. She didn't look at the gala guests or the sprawling estate. She looked directly at the woman in the torn designer dress. "Serena Sterling?" Vance asked, her voice carrying the weight of a closing cell door. "This is a mistake," Serena croaked, though the fire had gone out of her. "My sister, she's framing me. We have the wire transfer logs, the offshore account signatures, and the testimony from your former head of logistics," Vance interrupted, stepping up the stairs. "And as of 10 minutes ago, we have the official complaint filed by the new owner of the Sterling Holdings." Vance glanced at Julian, a brief, professional nod of acknowledgement. Then she turned back to Serena. "Hands behind your back." The click of the handcuffs was the loudest sound in the night. It was the sound of a decade of lies finally snapping. Serena didn't fight. She went limp, her head hanging low as she was led down the stairs she had descended like a queen only 2 hours earlier. Arthur tried to step toward Julian again, a pathetic, hopeful smile twitching on his lips. "Now that that's handled, Julian, perhaps we could discuss the living arrangements. The estate is still technically—" "The estate is mine, Arthur," Julian said, using his first name for the first time in her life. The word felt like a clean break. "The cars, the art, the wine in the cellar, everything. You and Beatrice have until noon tomorrow to remove your personal effects. Anything left behind will be liquidated." "You can't do that," Beatrice gasped, finally looking up. "We're your parents." Julian looked at the woman who had watched her be belittled for years and said nothing. She looked at the man who had just offered up his other daughter to save his own skin. "I'm a Sterling," Julian said, her voice as cold and final as the granite beneath her feet. "I thought you'd appreciate me following the family tradition of protecting the bottom line." Marcus Thorne opened the door to the SUV. Julian stepped inside, the leather interior smelling of cedar and new beginnings. As the car pulled away, she didn't look back at the house, or the flashing lights, or the 2 people standing on the porch, suddenly realizing they were strangers in their own home. She stared straight ahead, watching the gates of the estate swing open to let her out, and then close firmly behind her. For the first time in 30 years, the weight in her chest was gone, replaced by a terrifying, beautiful emptiness. The war was over. The ship had sunk. And Julian was the only one who had learned how to swim. 6 months later, the executive suite of the newly restructured Sterling Financial didn't smell like Serena's cloying lilies anymore. Instead, it carried the sharp, clean scent of ozone from the morning's rain and the deep, grounding aroma of dark roast coffee. Julianne Sterling sat behind the desk that had once belonged to her father, her fingers tracing the smooth, reclaimed oak surface. She had replaced the mahogany monstrosity Arthur had favored within a week of taking control. The door opened with a rhythmic, familiar knock. Marcus Thorne stepped inside, dropping a thick manila folder onto the desk. He looked younger than he had during the frantic weeks of the investigation, the tension in his shoulders replaced by the easy stride of a man who had won the long game. "The final sentencing came through this morning," Marcus said, taking the seat across from her. He didn't wait for her to ask. 10 years for Serena. No possibility of early release, given the scale of the fraud and the number of victims. The judge wasn't moved by her unfamiliarity with the filing's defense. Julianne leaned back, her chair silent and perfectly balanced. She thought of Serena Sterling as she had appeared in the courtroom 3 days ago. The designer silk had been replaced by a cheap, ill-fitting navy suit. Her hair, once a masterpiece of high-end salons, had looked brittle and dull under the harsh fluorescent lights. For the first time in her life, Serena hadn't been the center of a social circle. She had been a number on a docket. When the bailiff had led her away, she had looked toward the gallery, searching for an ally, a fan, or a friend. She had found only the cold, steady gaze of the sister she had spent a lifetime belittling. "And Arthur?" Julianne asked, her voice calm. "He's officially moved into the 2-bedroom rental in the valley," Marcus replied, a ghost of a smirk playing on his lips. "I'm told he spent the morning arguing with the building manager about the lack of a concierge. He tried to use his old club membership card as a reference, but they've already revoked his status. He's discovering that without the Sterling fortune, he's just a bitter old man in a cheap cardigan." Julianne nodded slowly. The image of Arthur Sterling, the man who had valued the family crest more than his own flesh and blood, living in a space where the walls were thin enough to hear his neighbors' televisions, was a specific kind of justice. He wasn't in a cell, but he was in a prison of his own irrelevance. Beatrice had fared slightly better, tucked away in a quiet condo funded by a modest, ironclad trust Julianne had established, enough for a comfortable life, but not enough to buy the silence or the complicity of others ever again. "You did it, Julianne," Marcus said, his tone softening. "The firm is solvent, the victims are being compensated from the recovered assets, and the name actually means something honest for the first time in 30 years. "At a cost," she murmured, looking toward the window. "Are you regretting it?" "No," she said firmly. "But I realized this morning that I'm the only one left in the house. I tore down the rot, Marcus, but I had to take the walls with it." She felt the weight of the silence in the room. It was the victory she had planned for, the one she had sacrificed her sleep and her youth to achieve. She had the power, the wealth, and the vindication. But the family dinners, however poisoned they had been, were gone. The shared history, however fraudulent, was erased. She was the architect of a new foundation, but she was standing on it alone. Marcus stood up, adjusting his jacket. "Detective Sarah Vance called. She wanted to let you know the final audit is closed. She said to tell you that it's rare to see the person who finds the bodies also be the one to pay for the funerals." Julianne watched him leave, the glass door clicking shut behind him. She turned her chair toward the window, looking out over the city. Below, the streets were teeming with people moving toward their own goals, their own small wars. She opened the bottom drawer of her desk and pulled out a small, tarnished silver frame. It wasn't a photo of Serena or Arthur. It was a picture of herself at 7 years old, standing in the garden of the old estate, holding a handful of weeds she'd mistaken for flowers. She looked happy because she hadn't yet learned that her value was a variable in someone else's ledger. Julian set the photo on the corner of the desk. The Sterling name was no longer a weapon or a lie. It was simply hers. She picked up her pen, the cold metal a reminder of the reality she had built, and turned back to the stack of reports. The emptiness was still there, but as the sun broke through the clouds and hit the glass, it didn't feel like a void anymore. It felt like a clean slate.
I hope you enjoyed this wild story. Don't forget to subscribe for more. See you in the next one.